The bridge was rated for 5 tons. Diane Whitfield didn't care about ratings. She sent concrete trucks across it anyway. I warned her. Then she stripped me of my title. Months later, I stopped warning anyone. I just watched. And I waited. Because I knew exactly when it would fall, and I made sure no one was standing on it when it did. My name is Elena Reyes. I'm a structural engineer, married to Mark, mother to an 11-year-old named Sophie who still believes I can fix anything with a wrench and a calculator. We moved to Cedar Hollow Estates 4 years ago, drawn in by the oak-lined streets and the little footbridge over Miller's Creek that everyone photographed for their Christmas cards. I volunteered for the HOA's infrastructure committee because it was the one thing I actually knew how to do well. My father had been a county bridge inspector for 30 years before he passed. And I grew up hearing him talk about load limits the way other kids heard bedtime stories. I thought Cedar Hollow would be a quiet place to raise my daughter. Diane Whitfield had been HOA president for 9 years. She ran the board like a queen ran a court, smiling for the newsletter photos, ruling everyone else's fences and mailbox colors with an iron fist. People said crossing her meant crossing the whole neighborhood, because half the block owed her favors, and the other half was too scared to find out what happened if they didn't. The Miller's Creek Bridge had been certified in 1987 for a 5-ton load limit, a small steel and timber span barely 40 feet long. It connected the main neighborhood to the clubhouse, the pool, and the park where every kid in Cedar Hollow learned to ride a bike. The sign at its entrance was faded but still legible. If anyone bothered to look up, Diane wanted a new pool cabana, an enormous one, with a stone fireplace and a bar, something she could show off at the next regional HOA awards dinner. She'd already picked the granite countertops before the permits were even filed. The only obstacle standing between her and her dream cabana was distance, time, and one small, inconvenient bridge. The shortest route for construction trucks ran straight across Miller's Creek Bridge. The long way, around the service road, added 20 extra minutes each trip. Diane decided 20 minutes was 20 minutes too many. She never asked the committee. She never asked me, and called her nephew, a contractor named Ray Dobbins. I found out by accident, watching from my kitchen window as a 10-ton concrete truck rumbled across the bridge like it weighed nothing at all. The old timbers groaned under the load, a sound I felt in my chest before I heard it. I grabbed my laptop and pulled up the county's original 1987 certification within the hour. 5 tons. Stamped in black ink by an inspector named Harold Whitfield, Diane's late husband. I stared at that signature a long time, telling myself it meant nothing, that surely the numbers had just been rounded conservatively. I didn't know yet how wrong I was about to be. I emailed Diane that same afternoon, polite and professional, attaching the certification and asking that construction traffic reroute around the service road until we could get the bridge re-inspected. I copied the whole board, because I'd learned early that anything not in writing simply didn't exist to Diane Whitfield. Her reply came 4 minutes later. Elena, sweetie, that bridge has held up fine for decades. I think we can trust it a little longer than your spreadsheet does. I read the word sweetie 3 times before I closed my laptop, because I already knew exactly what kind of fight I just started. I brought it up at the next board meeting, standing in front of 11 neighbors in folding chairs, laying out the math as plainly as I could. 10 tons on a 5-ton bridge wasn't caution. It was a bet, And bridges don't lose bets quietly. They lose them all at once, usually with someone standing on them. Diane cut me off before I finished, thanking me for my passion in the tone people use for children who've said something embarrassing at dinner. She moved straight to new business, the color of the clubhouse awnings, as if I'd never spoken. 2 board members wouldn't meet my eyes. After the meeting, my neighbor Priya pulled me aside in the parking lot. "She's not going to listen," Priya whispered, glancing back at the clubhouse. "Last year she got the previous safety chair removed for asking about the pool drain code. Don't make yourself a target, Elena. Just document everything." So I did. Camera and mounted it on a tree overlooking the bridge, angled to catch the license plates and axle counts of every truck that crossed. I told myself it was just for my own records, in case anyone ever needed proof. I had no idea yet how much proof I'd eventually need. Within a week I had 11 trucks logged, every one of them well over the limit. Ray Dobbins' crew crossed at all hours, sometimes twice a day, hauling rebar, lumber, and eventually the first loads of wet concrete for the Cabana Foundation. The bridge deck had started to show a faint new sag near the east support beam. I photographed the sag from the creek bed below, standing in ankle-deep water with my father's old tape measure, checking the deflection against what I remembered from his manuals. It wasn't dramatic yet, but it was there, and it was new, and nobody but me seemed to be looking for it. I requested an emergency inspection through the county the following Monday, using my professional license to file the report myself since Diane controlled the HOA's usual contracted inspector. I attached my photos, my measurements, and the original 1987 certification. I expected a fight. 3 days later, the county engineer called to say the original 1987 inspection file had a strange gap. A follow-up structural report that should have existed, referenced in the file index, was simply missing. He asked if I knew anything about a second document from that year. I told him I'd never heard of one. That was twist number 1. Diane found out about my county filing before I'd even hung up the phone. Someone on the board had told her within the hour. She called me directly, her voice syrup-sweet and razor underneath. Going over my head to the county. "Elena, that's not very neighborly." I told her safety wasn't a neighborly courtesy. She hung up on me. The next morning, a laminated notice appeared on the community Facebook group. The infrastructure committee was being restructured for efficiency. My name wasn't on the new roster. Diane had removed me without a vote, citing a bylaw clause about presidential discretion during active capital projects. Nobody on the board objected. Nobody wanted to be next. I still had my trail camera, though. And I still had my father's old contacts at the county bridge division. Men who remembered him fondly and answered my calls even after I'd lost my official standing. Diane could take my title. She couldn't take what I already knew, or what the creek bed kept quietly recording for me. Word spread through the neighborhood fast, the way it always does in places like Cedar Hollow. Some neighbors thanked me quietly in the grocery store parking lot, looking over their shoulders as they did it. Others crossed the street to avoid me entirely, afraid that standing near me made them a target of Diane's next newsletter. Diane's newsletter that week featured a full paragraph about certain residents spreading fear-based misinformation about our beautiful community bridge. She didn't use my name. She didn't have to. Cedar Hollow knew exactly who she meant, and half of them believed her without ever reading the certification I'd posted. My husband Mark found me at the kitchen table one night surrounded by printouts, the trail camera's memory card plugged into my laptop, timestamps and truck weights scrawled in the margins. "You don't have to fix this alone," he said. I told him someone had to, because Diane clearly never would. Sophie asked me at dinner why the mean lady at the pool didn't like me anymore. I told her it wasn't about liking. It was about a bridge that some grown-ups needed to be more careful with. She nodded like she understood, then asked if the bridge was going to fall down. I didn't have a good answer. The cabana construction accelerated through the following weeks. Ray Dobbins brought in heavier equipment, a mini excavator, pallets of stone, an 8-ton delivery truck that crossed twice in one afternoon. Each crossing added another entry to my log, another timestamp, another small crack widening somewhere I couldn't yet see from the surface. I noticed Ray's crew wore no visible contractor licensing on their trucks, which struck me as odd for a project this size. I ran the company name through the state contractor database that night and found nothing registered under it at all. Twist number 2. Ray Dobbins wasn't a licensed contractor. He was Diane's nephew, freshly out of a 2-year trade program. I filed that discovery away too, alongside everything else, unsure yet how or when I'd use it. Diane had spent 9 years building a wall of loyalty and fear around herself. I understood by now that facts alone wouldn't be enough to bring that wall down. I would need the right facts, delivered at exactly the right moment. At the next open board meeting, a resident named Tom Yeager stood up uninvited and asked why the bridge sign still said 5 tons if the HOA president's own contractor was clearly ignoring it.
Diane smiled through gritted teeth and said the sign was outdated and would...
There were no modern engineering standards. There was no new inspection. There was only Diane, deciding unilaterally that a 40-year-old warning sign was inconvenient and therefore wrong. I sat in the back row, saying nothing, watching 30 neighbors nod along as if she just explained simple arithmetic instead of rewritten physics by decree. That night I drove out to the bridge alone and knelt in the mud beneath the east support beam with a flashlight in my teeth. The sag I'd measured weeks earlier had grown by nearly half an inch. I photographed it from 4 angles, my hands shaking slightly, not from cold but from finally understanding how close this was. I called the county engineer again the next morning, off the record this time, and asked him a direct question: what would actually happen if a bridge like this failed under repeated overload? He was quiet for a moment before answering. "It wouldn't warn you first, Mrs. Reyes." That sentence stayed with me for days. It wasn't fear exactly. I'd spent my whole career around structures and knew better than to panic over math. But it reframed everything. This wasn't a dispute about HOA politics anymore. It was a countdown, and Diane Whitfield had no idea she was the one setting the clock. I started keeping a second log, separate from my professional documentation, a private list of exact days and times when the bridge saw heavy foot traffic. Saturday morning yoga classes at the clubhouse. Sunday afternoon pool hours. The Tuesday farmers market that drew half the neighborhood across that narrow deck with strollers and folding chairs. If I couldn't stop the overloading, I decided I could at least map every window when people were most likely to be standing on that bridge when it finally gave. It felt insane to think in those terms about my own neighborhood. It felt more insane to imagine not thinking that way at all. Diane escalated the cabana timeline, apparently rattled by Tom Yeager's question at the meeting. She announced a community celebration for the cabana's grand opening, scheduled just 5 weeks out, meaning Ray's crew would need to pour the heaviest concrete loads yet, all crossing the bridge, all within a brutally compressed window. I requested the county force an emergency closure, citing my documented deflection measurements and the missing 1987 follow-up report. The county engineer told me, apologetically, that without a scheduled inspection appointment or clear evidence of imminent failure, his hands were tied by procedure. Diane, turned out, had already preemptively called the county herself. She told them I was a disgruntled former committee member with a personal vendetta, exaggerating routine wear for attention. It worked. Sympathetic but bound by process, scheduled a formal inspection for 6 weeks out, 1 week after Diane's grand opening celebration. The timing wasn't a coincidence. It was a wall. I sat with that wall for 2 days before deciding I needed more than measurements and a trail camera. I needed the missing 1987 report Diane's late husband had supposedly filed, the one referenced in the county index but never found. If it existed anywhere, it would be in my late father's old archived files. My father had kept boxes of duplicate county paperwork in our garage attic for decades, a habit my mother always complained about and I'd never had the heart to throw away. I spent a whole Saturday up there in the heat, sneezing through dust, sorting through folders labeled in his careful engineer's handwriting. I found it near the bottom of the 4th box, a carbon copy structural addendum from 1987, co-signed by my father as a junior county reviewer. It flagged the bridge's original rebar spacing as substandard, recommending a reinforcement retrofit before certification could be finalized. Someone had crossed out the recommendation in red pen. Twist number 3. The handwriting crossing out my father's recommendation matched Harold Whitfield's signature on the final certification. Diane's late husband, the original inspector. He hadn't just approved a marginal bridge. He'd overruled a documented safety concern, apparently under pressure, and buried the paper trail that would have proven it happened. I sat on that attic floor for a long time holding the addendum, thinking about my father, who died believing every bridge he'd ever touched was sound. I wondered if he'd known what happened to his recommendation, or if Harold Whitfield had simply erased it and let a good man's name stay quietly attached to a compromised structure. I didn't confront Diane with it immediately. I understood now that timing mattered as much as truth did in Cedar Hollow. If I revealed the document too early, she would simply discredit it, bury it, or worse, destroy the bridge faster trying to finish before anyone else could verify what I'd found. Instead, I photographed every page, scanned them into 3 separate cloud backups, and mailed a physical copy to my own P.O. box under a different name, a trick my father had once taught me for protecting evidence from people who controlled the room you were standing in. Diane controlled Cedar Hollow completely. She did not control the mail. Ray's crew kept crossing daily now, sometimes with loads I estimated near 11 tons based on axle compression alone. I widened my private log to include a real-time text alert system, quietly asking 3 trusted neighbors, Priya, Tom, and an elderly widower named Mr. Castellano, to text me the second they saw a truck approaching the span. Mr. turned out, had lived in Cedar Hollow since it was built in the 80s and remembered the original bridge construction firsthand. Over coffee one afternoon, he told me something that made my stomach drop. Harold Whitfield hadn't just inspected the bridge. He'd personally cut costs on the rebar order to save the developer money. Twist number 4. Diane hadn't discovered a shortcut. She'd inherited one, built by her own late husband decades earlier, and had spent 9 years as HOA president sitting directly on top of a structural time bomb she either didn't fully understand or had simply chosen never to look at closely. I began to suspect it might be the second option. Diane wasn't stupid, cruel, controlling, dismissive, yes, but never stupid. The more I watched her push construction traffic across that bridge with such reckless urgency, the more I wondered whether she actually wanted something to go wrong, on her own terms and her own schedule. That suspicion crystallized one evening when I overheard her at the clubhouse, her voice carrying through an open window, talking to someone about the insurance appraisal coming in higher than expected on the old structure. I stopped in the parking lot, pretending to check my phone, and listened to every word I could catch. She was talking to an insurance adjuster, not a contractor. The HOA carried a policy on the bridge itself, separate from general liability, one that would pay out substantially if the structure failed and needed full replacement. Enough, apparently, to cover a much grander new bridge than the current budget could ever justify. Twist number 5. I drove home that night turning the pieces over and over. Diane wasn't just careless. She was accelerating traffic across a bridge she likely knew was compromised, on a deadline that conveniently aligned with an insurance appraisal, all while publicly insisting everything was perfectly safe. It wasn't neglect anymore. It was a plan. I couldn't prove intent yet, only pattern. And pattern alone wouldn't be enough to stop a woman who'd spent 9 years being unaccountable to everyone around her. I needed something undeniable: video, weight data, a paper trail she couldn't spin into another newsletter about misinformation. I needed the bridge itself to testify. I ordered a set of strain gauges the same week, the kind my father used to keep in his truck for field assessments, and mounted them discreetly along the underside of the span at night, wading into the creek in waders under a half-moon while Mark held the flashlight and worried out loud the whole time. The sensors fed live deflection data to an app on my phone, a small mercy of modern engineering my father never had access to. Within days I had a clean, timestamped graph showing the bridge flexing well past its rated tolerance every single time one of Ray's trucks crossed. The math was no longer theoretical. I brought the data to Priya first, then Tom, laying it across my kitchen table like evidence in a trial, because in every way that mattered, it was becoming exactly that. Priya went pale looking at the deflection spikes. "How long until it actually fails?" she asked. I told her the truth. I didn't know. What I did know was that failure wouldn't come with a warning. My father's old colleague had told me as much weeks earlier. Steel and timber don't negotiate. They hold, and hold, and hold, compounding invisible fatigue with every overloaded crossing, until one day the math simply runs out and there is nothing left holding it all. I requested a private meeting with the full board. No residents, presenting only the strain gauge data and asking for an immediate halt to construction traffic. Diane allowed the meeting but controlled the room from the first minute, reframing my data as unverified amateur sensors, installed without HOA authorization, possibly illegal trespass on shared property. 2 board members actually nodded at that framing, more concerned about liability for my sensor installation than about the bridge itself. I watched 9 years of Diane's careful cultivation pay off in real time. A room full of adults choosing comfortable denial over an inconvenient, uncomfortable, well-documented truth sitting right in front of them. After the meeting, board member Carla Sims pulled me aside in the hallway, glancing nervously toward Diane's office door. "She has something on half of us," Carla whispered. "Zoning variance for my deck. Permit." She looked the other way on. "If I cross her, she pulls it, and I lose my whole addition." Twist number 6. That was how Diane really ran Cedar Hollow. Not through popularity, but through quiet, accumulated leverage over nearly everyone on the board. Small favors granted and small violations overlooked. All of it repayable on demand the moment anyone considered standing against her. I finally understood why no one but a handful of neighbors would speak up. I couldn't outleverage a woman who'd spent 9 years collecting favors like ammunition. But leverage wasn't the only currency that mattered here. Truth, documented precisely enough and released at precisely the right moment, could still outweigh it. I just had to make sure it landed somewhere Diane couldn't quietly bury or spin away. I started drafting a formal complaint to the state HOA regulatory board, attaching the strain data, the missing 1987 addendum, the axle weight logs, and a sworn statement from Mr. Castellano about the original construction shortcuts. I didn't file it yet. Undeniable proof of intent. Not just negligence. That proof arrived sooner than I expected. Delivered by Carla Sims herself 2 weeks later. Quietly, in a plain envelope left in my mailbox with no note attached. Inside was a printed email chain between Diane and the insurance adjuster, forwarded apparently by mistake to the whole board's shared drive before Diane caught the error and deleted it. The emails discussed accelerated depreciation timelines and optimal claim conditions for the bridge, with Diane explicitly asking whether a documented structural failure during active, permitted construction would trigger a faster and larger payout than a routine planned replacement. The adjuster's reply was carefully worded, but the intent underneath it was unmistakable. Twist number 7. Diane Whitfield wasn't just recklessly overloading a compromised bridge for convenience. She was engineering the conditions for its collapse, timing it around an insurance claim, using her own nephew's unlicensed labor and a fabricated grand opening deadline as cover for what amounted, in plain language, to premeditated structural fraud. I sat with those printed emails for an entire sleepless night, the strain gauge app open on my phone beside them, watching the tiny green deflection numbers tick upward with every truck that still dared to cross. Somewhere underneath all of it was a simple, terrifying fact. Diane wanted this bridge to fail. What she hadn't planned for, I realized slowly, was someone underneath her who understood exactly how and when that failure would happen, and who had spent weeks quietly mapping every hour the bridge sat empty versus every hour it filled with strollers, dog walkers, and Saturday morning yoga mats. If Diane was racing toward a scheduled collapse for profit, I could not simply expose her fast enough to stop the physics already in motion. The rebar was already fatigued. The fraud was already documented. What I could still control was making absolutely certain no one was standing on that bridge when the math finally ran out. I began quietly urging neighbors, one conversation at a time, to avoid the bridge crossing during evening and early morning hours, framing it as general caution rather than alarm, careful never to reveal exactly how much I now knew. Priya helped spread the word through the yoga group. Tom rerouted the farmer's market schedule slightly. Diane noticed the drop in foot traffic and, predictably, framed it in her newsletter as more fear-mongering from disgruntled residents undermining community spirit ahead of the Grand Cabana opening. I read that newsletter standing at my kitchen counter and felt something shift inside me from fear into something colder, steadier, and far more resolved. I finally filed the formal complaint with the state regulatory board that same night, attaching everything, the addendum, the strain data, the axle logs, and the leaked insurance emails. I requested an emergency review, understanding it would likely take weeks to process. Weeks. Diane's grand opening deadline would not allow this bridge to survive. The complaint receipt confirmation landed in my inbox at 11:47 p.m. I closed my laptop, walked out onto my back porch, and looked toward the dark shape of the bridge. Across the neighborhood, thinking about my father, about the missing addendum with his name on it, and about how close everything now was to breaking wide open. For a strange, quiet stretch of nearly 2 weeks, almost nothing happened. Construction slowed as Ray's crew waited on a delayed stone delivery for the cabana's fireplace. The bridge sat mostly still, my strain gauge readings finally settling back toward something resembling normal. Cedar Hollow, for a moment, felt almost peaceful again. Diane seemed to soften slightly too, appearing at the pool with sunscreen and a magazine, waving cheerfully at neighbors as though nothing had ever happened between us. I didn't trust the calm for a second. I'd learned enough about her by now to know silence from Diane Whitfield was never actually silence. I used the lull to quietly reinforce my own position, meeting privately with the county engineer to walk him through everything I'd gathered, off the record but thorough. He listened without interrupting, his face growing more serious with every page. Finally admitting the missing 1987 addendum changed the entire risk profile of his assessment. He couldn't force an emergency closure without board or resident consent, still bound by the same maddening procedure as before, but he promised to move the scheduled inspection up if he could find any administrative opening. It wasn't a victory, a small crack of daylight in an otherwise sealed process. I spent the quiet stretch reinforcing my neighborhood network too, meeting Priya, Tom, Carla, and Mr. Castellano at my kitchen table with coffee and the full binder of evidence spread out for everyone to see together for the first time. Carla cried a little, apologizing for staying silent as long as she had. "She has something on all of us," Carla said again, quieter this time, "but she doesn't have anything on you anymore. You gave that up when she took your title." I hadn't thought of it that way before, but she was right. Diane's leverage only worked on people who still had something left to lose from her. Mr. offered to speak publicly at the next open meeting, his memory of the original construction shortcuts finally ready to be said out loud instead of murmured over coffee. At 81, he said, Diane's leverage meant nothing to him anymore. He had no deck permit to protect, no favor left to fear losing. Sophie noticed the shift in the house too, the quiet, focused energy replacing weeks of worried tension. She asked me one evening if the bridge was going to be okay. I told her the bridge wasn't the thing that needed fixing anymore. It was everyone finally being honest about what had happened to it. Mark started helping in ways I hadn't asked for, cross-referencing county permit records late at night, finding 2 more instances where Diane had waived inspection requirements for HOA projects tied to contractors with family connections to the board. It wasn't the bridge, but it painted a pattern the regulatory board would find impossible to ignore. I let myself feel, for the first time in months, something close to hope during that quiet stretch. Not that the bridge was safe, because I knew better than anyone that it wasn't, but that the truth had finally accumulated enough weight of its own to eventually collapse Diane's version of events instead. The stone delivery for the cabana fireplace finally arrived on a Thursday, 3 weeks behind Diane's original schedule and dangerously close to her self-imposed grand opening date. I felt the calm in the neighborhood tighten immediately, like a held breath, everyone sensing without quite knowing why that something was about to move fast again. Ray's crew doubled their pace overnight, working past dark under portable floodlights. The whine of machinery replacing the crickets Cedar Hollow usually fell asleep to. My strain gauge app buzzed with fresh deflection spikes for the first time in 2 weeks, each one sharper than anything I'd recorded before the quiet stretch began. I drove past the bridge late that Thursday night and saw Diane herself standing at the construction site with Ray, gesturing emphatically at a printed schedule under the floodlights. Whatever pause the stone delay had forced on her plans, she was clearly determined to make up every single lost day before her opening deadline. I went home and sat with the strain gauge data until nearly 2 in the morning, watching the deflection numbers climb steadily with each late-night crossing. The quiet was over. I understood with sudden, absolute clarity, was going to happen fast, and it was going to happen on Diane's terms, not mine. Diane announced a revised timeline at the next open meeting, tightening the grand opening to just 11 days out, citing unforeseen supply delays now fully resolved as the reason for the accelerated poor schedule ahead. She didn't mention the missing 3 weeks. She didn't mention the insurance emails Carla had leaked either. What she did mention, smiling brightly at the packed folding chairs, was a special celebratory ribbon cutting planned for the new cabana, with the entire community invited to gather right at the bridge for photos before crossing together to the clubhouse for refreshments. My stomach turned cold the moment she said it out loud. She was planning to gather the whole neighborhood on that bridge, deliberately, for a photo. Whether she understood the structural risk consciously or simply didn't care enough to think it through, the result was the same: dozens of families, children, strollers, all standing exactly where I'd spent months trying to keep everyone away from. I raised my hand and asked, as calmly as I could manage, whether the county's delayed inspection would be completed before that ribbon-cutting date. Diane's smile flickered for just a fraction of a second before recovering fully. The bridge has been fine for 40 years. Elena, I think it'll survive one more party. The room laughed, warm and easy, at the idea that a 5-ton bridge groaning under 11-ton loads for months might not survive a crowd. I sat back down, my face burning, understanding in that moment that reasoning with this room the normal way was no longer an option left available to me. After the meeting, I called the county engineer directly, no longer willing to wait on administrative openings or scheduled procedure. I told him plainly that a public gathering event was now planned directly on the compromise span within 11 days, and asked what it would actually take to force an emergency closure before then. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. Documented risk of imminent structural failure, presented formally with supporting data, can trigger an emergency order independent of the HOA board's cooperation, he said carefully. But Elena, that's a serious step. It'll be public. Are you sure you're ready for that? I told him I was more than ready. I'd been ready for months, quietly gathering exactly the kind of documentation he was now describing, never fully allowing myself to imagine I might actually need to use every piece of it at once, against a woman who controlled almost every lever of power in my own neighborhood. I spent the next 3 days assembling the formal emergency petition, strain gauge deflection curves overlaid against the original 1987 rating. The missing addendum with my father's flagged rebar concern, Mr. Castellano's sworn statement about construction shortcuts, and Carla's leaked insurance correspondence, all bound into a single, devastating narrative timeline. I filed it with the county on a Tuesday morning, copying the state HOA regulatory board on the same submission, ensuring Diane could not quietly intercept or bury this one the way she had every previous inconvenience raised against her. Within 6 hours, the county engineer called to confirm an emergency inspector would be dispatched. Diane found out before the inspector even arrived, apparently tipped off by someone on the board still loyal enough to warn her. She called me directly that evening, her voice no longer syrup-sweet, stripped down to something harder and colder I hadn't heard from her before.
You're trying to destroy...
I told her I was trying to stop a bridge from destroying someone's child. She laughed, short and bitter. It's a bridge, Elena. It's not a bomb. Addendum. About the insurance emails. About 11-ton trucks crossing a 5-ton span. And said nothing at all, letting the silence answer for me. The emergency inspector arrived 2 days later. A stern, unhurried man named Frank Delgado who walked the entire span twice, photographed every visible crack, and personally reviewed the strain gauge data I'd printed for him. He didn't say much on site. He didn't need to. Everything before his report ever would. Diane met him at the bridge too, all warmth and hospitality, offering him iced tea and a tour of the beautiful new cabana nearby, as if friendliness alone might soften whatever findings were coming. Frank Delgado accepted the tea politely and then quietly told her the bridge would need to close pending full review. Diane's smile finally cracked in public for the first time in 9 years, right there in front of half a dozen neighbors who'd gathered to watch the inspection unfold. Close it? In 9 days, she said, her voice rising. Frank told her, evenly, that the bridge simply might not have 9 days left. That sentence landed in the small crowd like a stone dropped into still water. I watched neighbors who'd laughed at me a week earlier go pale, glancing toward the span they'd crossed thousands of times without a second thought, suddenly seeing it the way I'd been seeing it alone for months. Diane recovered quickly, pivoting straight into damage control, insisting to Frank and to everyone watching that this was simply standard precaution, and the cabana opening would proceed as planned via the long service road detour. She framed the closure as routine, almost boring, robbing it of the alarm it actually deserved. Frank Delgado wasn't finished, though. He told the small crowd, plainly, that his preliminary report would recommend the county investigate not just the bridge's current condition, but the history of load violations documented over recent months, along with unresolved questions about the original 1987 certification. Diane's face went rigid at that. She excused herself abruptly, claiming a prior obligation, and disappeared toward the clubhouse without another word to the gathered neighbors.
I watched her go.
Understanding that whatever calm exterior she'd maintained through 9 years of quiet leverage and control had just, for the first time, genuinely and visibly cracked in public. The bridge closure went up officially the next morning. Orange barricades. A formal county notice stapled to the old faded 5-ton sign. The whole crossing roped off with caution tape fluttering in the breeze. I stood there a long time just looking at it, feeling something between relief and dread in equal measure. Relief, because for the first time in months, I knew for certain no one would be standing on that span while the physics underneath it kept quietly working against everything holding it together. Dread, because I understood Diane Whitfield well enough by now to know a closure notice would not simply stop her plans. Sure enough, by that same afternoon, whispers spread through the neighborhood that Diane was exploring emergency structural reinforcement to reopen the bridge before her ribbon-cutting date. Hiring an outside engineer she claimed could stabilize the span with temporary steel bracing in under a week. Fast enough to save her deadline entirely. I requested the name of this outside engineer through a contact on the board still willing to talk to me quietly. It came back to a small firm 2 counties over with exactly 1 listed employee. A man named Gary Fenn, whose license, when I checked, had lapsed 18 months earlier. Twist number 8. Diane was preparing to hire an unlicensed engineer to slap temporary bracing on a structurally compromised bridge with a documented history of falsified original certification,
purely to force it back open in time for a party, regardless of what Frank Delgado's official inspection ultimately concluded about its true condition underneath.
I forwarded Gary Fenn's lapsed license information straight to Frank Delgado and the State Regulatory Board within the hour, attaching it to my already substantial complaint file. Frank called me back within 20 minutes, his voice tight with something I hadn't heard from him before. Genuine alarm, professional and personal both. If she attempts unauthorized reinforcement work on a bridge under active emergency closure order, he told me, that moves this from a civil HOA dispute into criminal territory. Obstruction, at minimum. Endangerment, depending on what happens next. I asked him what happens next usually looked like in cases like this. He was quiet for a moment before answering honestly. Usually, Mrs. Reyes, it looks like someone getting hurt before anyone stops them. I thanked him, hung up, and sat very still at my kitchen table, understanding that the countdown I'd been tracking for months had just entered its final, most dangerous phase. I called an emergency gathering at my own house that night. Priya, Tom, Carla, and Mr. Castellano crowded around my kitchen table again, the binder of evidence between us now 3 inches thick. I told them everything: the lapsed license, Frank's warning, the very real possibility Diane might try reinforcement work regardless of the order. Carla offered to monitor the board's private group chat, where Diane still occasionally revealed her true intentions when she thought only loyalists were reading. Tom volunteered to physically check the bridge site every evening after work. Mr. Stubborn and sharp despite his 81 years, insisted on taking the earliest morning shift himself. Priya suggested something none of us had considered, quietly notifying the local news station's consumer watchdog reporter, a woman named Denise Ortiz who'd covered HOA overreach stories before. Public attention, Priya argued, might accomplish what county procedure alone couldn't, forcing accountability faster than any bureaucratic timeline would otherwise allow. I hesitated at first, wary of escalating things further, still hoping somewhere underneath everything that Diane might simply back down once faced with enough documented consequence. But I thought of Frank's warning, of the missing addendum, of 11-ton trucks and a woman actively pursuing an unlicensed engineer, and finally agreed. I emailed Denise Ortiz that same night, attaching a carefully summarized version of the evidence. Enough to prove the story without revealing every source I still needed to protect. She called me back within the hour, her voice sharp with genuine interest. "This is bigger than an HOA dispute," she said. "This is public safety." Denise requested an on-camera interview within days, along with copies of the emergency closure order and Frank's preliminary inspection notes, both public record now that the county had officially acted. I agreed, understanding fully that once this story aired, there would be no quiet path back for either Diane or myself. The board's private group chat, meanwhile, revealed exactly what Carla had suspected it might. Diane messaged loyalists directly, instructing them to keep this contained, and reassuring everyone that Gary Fenn would have bracing installed, quietly, overnight, before anyone official notices. Carla forwarded me screenshots within minutes, her hands visibly shaking in the photo she sent alongside them. Overnight, before anyone official notices, told me everything I needed to know about timing. Diane wasn't planning reinforcement work during daylight, when residents might see and object. She was planning to sneak Gary Fenn and his crew across the bridge sometime after dark. Exactly the kind of window I'd spent months mapping for resident safety. I forwarded the screenshots immediately to Frank Delgado, who confirmed the county would station an overnight monitoring vehicle near the site starting that very evening, treating any unauthorized work attempt as active obstruction of an emergency order. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was, finally, official eyes watching the same darkness I'd been watching alone. Couldn't sleep that night, sitting by my bedroom window with a clear line of sight toward the bridge, my phone charged and ready beside me. Mark sat up with me for a while before finally drifting off around midnight. I stayed awake, watching, thinking about my father, about Sophie, about how close this had all become. Nothing happened that first night. No trucks, no floodlights, no sign of Gary Fenn or his lapsed license anywhere near Miller's Creek. I wondered, hopefully, whether Diane had gotten word about the county's monitoring vehicle and finally backed down, choosing caution over her ribbon-cutting deadline for the first time in this entire saga. I should have known better by now than to hope for that. Diane Whitfield had spent 9 years finding quiet ways around every obstacle placed in front of her. A single parked monitoring vehicle, I would soon learn, was simply one more obstacle she believed she could outmaneuver, given enough patience and the right kind of distraction. Denise Ortiz's story aired 2 nights later. A tight 4-minute segment featuring Frank Delgado's official statement about the emergency closure, Mr. Castellano's on-camera memory of the original construction shortcuts, and a brief, damning mention of documents suggesting the HOA president may have financial incentive tied to the bridge's eventual replacement. Diane wasn't named directly in the segment, Denise's producers insisting on careful legal language given the still unproven insurance angle. But every neighbor watching that night understood exactly who the story described. My phone buzzed with messages within minutes of it airing. Some supportive, a few still angry, most simply stunned. Diane called an emergency board meeting for the following evening, framing it as an opportunity to correct false narratives spreading through irresponsible local media. I attended, along with what felt like the entire neighborhood crammed into folding chairs, The clubhouse fuller than I'd ever seen it for any HOA gathering before. She stood at the podium, composed and polished as always, insisting the news segment had twisted routine safety caution into sensationalized fearmongering. She never once mentioned the leaked insurance emails, the lapsed engineer's license, or the missing 1987 addendum sitting in a binder 3 inches thick just a few rows behind her. Tom Yeager stood up first this time, no longer waiting to be called on, and asked directly whether Diane intended to pursue reinforcement work using an engineer whose license had lapsed 18 months earlier. The room went completely silent. Diane's composed expression flickered, just briefly, before she claimed she'd never heard that name before. Carla stood next, her voice shaking but clear, and read aloud from the printed board group chat screenshots. Diane's own words, instructing loyalists to keep the reinforcement plan contained and have it done quietly, overnight, before anyone official notices. The silence in the room shifted into something sharper, angrier, undeniable. Diane's face went white, then red, her hands gripping the podium edge as murmurs rippled through the crowded clubhouse around her. "Those messages are being taken completely out of context," she said, her voice climbing higher than I'd ever heard it. Nobody in the room looked convinced. Nobody was laughing this time. Mr. Slowly, using his cane for support, and addressed the room directly instead of Diane. "I've lived here since before that bridge was built," he said. "Harold Whitfield cut corners on the rebar to save money, and this woman has known it for years. She's not protecting this community. She's protecting a lie." The room erupted into overlapping conversation, neighbors turning to each other in visible shock. Diane's carefully built 9-year reputation cracking apart in real time in front of the entire community she'd controlled for so long. I sat quietly in the back, not needing to say anything at all. Everyone else was finally saying it for me. Diane attempted to regain control of the meeting, banging a small gavel against the podium, insisting on order and civility, but the room had already moved past her authority entirely. Board members who'd stayed loyal for years began quietly gathering their things, unwilling to be seen defending her any longer in public. She left the podium abruptly, claiming the meeting had devolved into a mob, and walked out through a side door without answering a single direct question about Gary Fenn, the insurance emails, or her plans for that night.
I watch it here go.
Understanding this was no longer a woman in control of anything. The meeting effectively dissolved into small clusters of stunned conversation after she left. Neighbors approaching me one by one to apologize for doubting me, for laughing at my earlier warnings, for the months I'd spent isolated and dismissed while trying to protect a bridge everyone else had taken for granted. I didn't feel triumphant standing in that clubhouse afterward the way I'd once imagined I might. Diane was cornered now, publicly and undeniably, but a cornered woman with 9 years of accumulated leverage and a fading window before her deadline felt, if anything, more dangerous than she'd ever been before this meeting. Carla texted me late that night, her message short and urgent. "She's not backing down. Just saw Ray's truck heading toward the bridge with Gary Fenn's van right behind it. It's almost midnight." I felt my whole body go cold, grabbing my coat before I'd even finished reading the message twice. I called Frank Delgado immediately, relieved when he picked up on the second ring. He confirmed the county's monitoring vehicle had been quietly moved 2 nights earlier after budget complaints from Diane's allies on the board framed as an unnecessary expense given the bridge was already officially closed. Twist number 9. Diane had exploited a budget technicality to remove the only official oversight standing between her and an unauthorized midnight reinforcement attempt.
Timing her move for the exact moment the county's watchful eyes had been pulled away, believing correctly that darkness and empty streets would finally give her the window she'd been chasing.
Frank told me he'd dispatch someone as fast as possible, but the nearest available county officer was at least 30 minutes out. 30 minutes felt like an eternity given what Ray's crew and an unlicensed engineer could do to an already compromised bridge in that amount of time, especially working under pressure and darkness. I drove toward Miller's Creek myself, Mark following close behind after I refused to wait for him to get properly dressed. We parked a block away, exactly as I'd instructed every trusted neighbor to do for months, and approached on foot, staying well clear of the span itself, watching from the tree line. Floodlights lit the bridge from Ray's truck, harsh and white against the dark creek water below. Gary Fenn's crew was already unloading steel bracing equipment, moving with the rushed, sloppy urgency of people trying to finish an illegal job before anyone official arrived to stop them properly in time. Diane stood near the bridge entrance herself, arms crossed, watching the work with an intensity that looked less like triumph and more like desperation. I understood, watching her from the shadows, that this wasn't really about a ribbon cutting or a cabana anymore. This was a woman trying to outrun consequences she could feel closing in. I texted Frank our exact location and situation, then texted Priya, Tom, and Carla the same, asking them to alert every neighbor they trusted to stay far away from the bridge tonight, no matter what curiosity or noise drew their attention. The last thing this situation needed was more people gathering nearby. Mr. Defiant even at 81, texted back that he was already on his porch watching with binoculars but promised to stay exactly where he was. I appreciated his restraint more than I could say in that moment, grateful that at least the people closest to this situation understood the stakes clearly. Gary Fenn's crew worked fast, bolting temporary steel supports beneath the span's weakest section, the same east support beam I'd measured sagging months earlier. From the tree line, even in poor light, I could see the work looked rushed, mismatched, nothing like the careful reinforcement a properly licensed engineer would have designed. Ray Dobbins argued with Gary Fenn at one point, their raised voices carrying faintly across the water, something about bolt spacing and load distribution that even, from a distance, sounded like two people who didn't fully understand what they were actually doing to a structure already pushed dangerously close to its limit. Diane checked her watch repeatedly, glancing toward the road as if expecting someone, her composure fraying visibly with every passing minute. I wondered if she was watching for county officers, or for something else entirely. I didn't have to wonder long. A second truck arrived 20 minutes later. Another concrete delivery for the cabana. My stomach dropped watching that second truck idle at the bridge entrance, engine running, waiting for Gary Fenn's rushed bracing work to finish so it could cross immediately afterward, apparently determined to squeeze in one final overloaded delivery before dawn. Deadline pressure clearly overriding whatever remaining caution Diane might have once possessed. I understood then, watching from the tree line with my heart pounding, exactly what was about to happen. Diane wasn't simply trying to sneak temporary bracing onto a closed bridge. She was preparing to send an overloaded concrete truck across it immediately afterward, testing rushed, unlicensed repair work against the exact conditions that had compromised it for months. Frank's promised officer still hadn't arrived. I checked my phone. Only 12 minutes had passed since my call, though it felt like hours standing in the cold, damp tree line watching Ray's crew tighten the last visible bolts on bracing that wobbled slightly even under its own weight in the floodlight glare. Mark gripped my arm, whispering that we needed to back further away, that whatever happened next wasn't something we could stop standing where we were. He was right, and I hated that he was right, hating even more the helpless feeling of watching a disaster assemble itself piece by piece in front of me. Gary Fenn finally signaled completion, stepping back from the span and giving Diane a thumbs up that looked more like a plea for reassurance than genuine confidence. Diane nodded sharply toward the waiting concrete truck driver, who began easing his heavy vehicle forward onto the bridge deck under the harsh white floodlights. I stopped breathing for a moment, watching those front tires roll onto timber that had been quietly failing for months, reinforced now by bracing installed in under 2 hours by a man whose license had lapsed a year and a half earlier, under pressure, in darkness, purely to beat a deadline nobody actually needed. The bridge held for the first few seconds, the truck creeping forward at a crawl, Gary Fenn watching anxiously from the bank below with a flashlight trained on the new bracing. I found myself praying, absurdly, that it would somehow hold long enough for county officers to simply arrive and force everyone off safely. It didn't hold. Across the water, sudden and unmistakable even from 100 yards away, followed instantly by the groan of failing timber and the shriek of stressed steel bracing tearing loose from bolts that had never been properly torqued in the rushed midnight installation Gary Fenn had performed. The east support beam gave first, the same beam I'd measured sagging months earlier, its fatigued core finally exhausted past every remaining margin. The bridge deck buckled beneath the truck's front axles, and for one suspended, silent moment, the entire structure seemed to hang impossibly between holding and falling completely apart. Then it fell. First, twisting sideways as the failing supports gave way beneath it, dragging the concrete truck down with it in a grinding, thunderous collapse that sent a spray of creek water and splintered timber high into the floodlit night air above Miller's Creek. The driver leapt clear at the last possible second, scrambling up the bank as his truck crashed nose first into the shallow water below, his heavy drum still slowly turning, wet concrete pouring uselessly into the creek where the bridge deck used to stand. Gary Fenn dropped his flashlight and simply stared, frozen. The sound alone was enough to wake half the neighborhood. Porch lights flicking on up and down the street as the collapse's echo rolled outward across Cedar Hollow. Mr. told me he'd heard it clearly from his porch, binoculars still raised, watching the whole thing happen exactly as he'd promised he would. In the sudden silence after the crash, I realized with overwhelming, dizzying relief that no one had actually been on the bridge itself when it finally gave way. The driver was safe on the bank. Ray's crew stood clustered near the entrance. Diane stood frozen exactly where she'd been standing, watch still on her wrist, the months of careful mapping, the quiet warnings to neighbors, the timing I'd tracked so obsessively. All of it had worked exactly as I'd hoped it would, even against a collapse I hadn't been able to prevent outright. The bridge had finally failed on its own terms, but it had failed completely empty. County officers arrived 8 minutes later, flashing lights sweeping across the wreckage, followed shortly by Frank Delgado himself, still in pajama pants under his county jacket, having driven straight over the moment he received word of the collapse. He surveyed the scene for a long moment before turning directly to Diane. "This bridge was under an active emergency closure order," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet crowd gathering along the bank. "Unauthorized reinforcement work performed by an unlicensed individual, followed by an active load crossing attempt. This isn't an accident, Mrs. Whitfield. Violation." Twist number 10. Diane opened her mouth to argue, her usual composure nowhere in sight. But Frank continued before she could speak, informing her plainly that the county would be pursuing a full investigation, including her financial records related to the bridge's insurance policy. Given the correspondence already forwarded to his office weeks earlier by concerned residents, I stepped forward finally from the tree line, no longer needing to hide, and handed Frank the printed insurance emails directly, along with my complete strain gauge deflection history spanning the past several months. He accepted them without surprise, clearly already aware from my earlier filings of exactly what I'd been documenting all along. Diane's eyes found mine across the wreckage-lit scene, something desperate and furious flashing across her face. "You did this," she said, her voice shaking. "You've been waiting for this the whole time." I told her, calmly, that I'd spent months trying to stop it. She'd been the one racing toward it the entire time. Ray Dobbins, standing nearby, suddenly seemed far more interested in distancing himself from his aunt than defending her, quietly telling one of the responding officers that he'd only followed instructions, that Diane had personally insisted on the timeline despite his own hesitation about the bridge's condition weeks earlier. Twist number 11 arrived quietly after that. Gary Fenn, still standing in shock near his abandoned reinforcement equipment, admitted almost immediately under an officer's questioning that his license had lapsed, that Diane had specifically sought him out because he'd take the job quietly and fast despite that fact, and that she'd paid him in cash to avoid any paper trail. The full picture assembled itself rapidly in the hours that followed. Officers documenting the scene while Diane stood increasingly isolated near the ruined bridge entrance, her allies from the board notably absent. Unwilling to be photographed anywhere near the wreckage of a disaster she could no longer spin into a sympathetic newsletter story. Denise Ortiz arrived with a camera crew just after sunrise, having been alerted by a neighbor's phone call within an hour of the collapse. Her follow-up segment aired that same evening, this time naming Diane Whitfield directly, the emergency closure violation, and the insurance correspondence now formally part of an active county investigation. The story spread beyond Cedar Hollow within days, picked up by regional outlets fascinated by the specifics. An HOA president accused of engineering conditions for a bridge collapse, an unlicensed engineer paid in cash, and a community whistleblower whose months of quiet documentation had ultimately kept anyone from being hurt. I didn't seek out that attention, uncomfortable with cameras and headlines, but I answered every question honestly when reporters eventually found their way to my door, always circling back to the same point. This had never been about credit or vindication. It had simply been about making sure no one stood on that bridge. The state HOA regulatory board moved with unusual speed given the media attention, opening a formal investigation into Diane's conduct within a week, subpoenaing the insurance correspondence Carla had originally leaked and the full financial records tied to the Cabana project's suspiciously overlapping construction and insurance timelines. Diane hired a lawyer within days, releasing a brief public statement calling the collapse a tragic accident and denying any intentional wrongdoing regarding the insurance claim. The statement convinced almost no one in Cedar Hollow, who'd watched the entire saga unfold in real time across months of newsletters, meetings, and finally that midnight collapse. The insurance company itself, alerted by the county investigation, launched its own internal fraud review, ultimately denying Diane's claim entirely once investigators confirmed the collapse occurred during an unauthorized, unlicensed reinforcement attempt performed in direct violation of an active emergency closure order. Twist number 12, her entire plan had backfired completely. Not only would Diane receive no insurance payout for the new bridge she'd hoped to fund through fraud, she now faced potential criminal charges for obstruction, endangerment, and insurance fraud, along with a wrongful construction lawsuit from the county and mounting legal fees from a lawyer clearly losing confidence in her case daily. Ray Dobbins cooperated fully with investigators once it became clear his aunt had no intention of shielding him from consequences either, providing text messages and timelines that further confirmed Diane had personally directed every rushed decision, from the unlicensed engineer to the deliberately timed midnight reinforcement attempt beating the county's monitoring gap. An emergency HOA meeting was called 2 weeks after the collapse, this time by the board itself rather than by Diane, who was formally asked to attend and account for her conduct in front of the full community she'd led for 9 years. I wasn't sure, walking in that evening, whether she'd actually show up. She did show up, arriving alone, without her usual entourage of loyal board allies, wearing none of the polished composure I'd grown so used to seeing from her. She looked smaller somehow, standing at the podium she'd once commanded so completely, facing a room that no longer offered her the benefit of any doubt. Carla read a formal motion aloud, drafted with legal guidance from the county, calling for Diane's immediate removal as HOA president pending the outcome of the state investigation. The motion cited 9 specific violations, from the falsified original certification to the unauthorized midnight reinforcement attempt that had directly caused the collapse. Diane requested a chance to speak before the vote, and the room, out of some lingering residue of 9 years' habit, allowed her the floor one final time. She stood there for a long moment, silent, before finally admitting, quietly, that she'd known about her late husband's original shortcut on the rebar order for years. I told myself it had held for 40 years. It would hold a little longer, she said, her voice cracking slightly. I told myself the insurance money would let me finally fix what he'd done wrong. Quietly, without anyone ever needing to know he'd cut those corners in the first place. Twist number 13. Delivered almost gently. It was, in its own strange way, the most honest thing I'd ever heard her say. A woman who'd spent 9 years protecting her late husband's reputation and her own control over Cedar Hollow, ultimately willing to risk everyone's safety rather than simply admit, years earlier, that something needed fixing the right way. It didn't excuse anything. It didn't undo the months of dismissal, the stripped title, the newsletter smears, or the very real danger her choices had created for an entire community. But it explained, finally, the desperate, reckless energy behind every decision she'd made once I'd first raised the alarm about that 5-ton limit. The board voted unanimously to remove her as president that same night, effective immediately, appointing an interim committee to oversee both the ongoing investigation and the community's next steps regarding a proper, fully funded bridge replacement built to modern engineering standards this time, with full transparency at every stage of the process. I was asked, somewhat to my own surprise, to chair that interim committee myself. The very role Diane had stripped from me months earlier now returned with the full backing of a community that finally understood exactly what my months of quiet documentation had actually prevented from happening to their families. I accepted, though not without hesitation, thinking of everything the past several months had cost, the isolation, the fear, the sleepless nights watching a bridge I couldn't single-handedly save. But I thought too of Sophie, of every child who'd ever crossed that span without a second thought, and said yes. The weeks following Diane's removal moved faster than the months preceding it ever had. The county finalized its investigation, formally charging Diane with insurance fraud, obstruction of an emergency closure order, and reckless endangerment, while Gary Fenn faced separate charges for practicing engineering without a valid license during the unauthorized reinforcement attempt. Ray Dobbins avoided formal charges after his full cooperation with investigators, though the state contractors board permanently barred him from future licensing eligibility given his role in the unauthorized construction work. He left Cedar Hollow entirely within a month, unable to face neighbors who'd once trusted his aunt's judgment completely. Diane's lawyer negotiated a plea agreement eventually, sparing her the harshest potential sentencing in exchange for full cooperation and restitution. But the damage to her standing proved far more permanent than any legal outcome ever could. She sold her house within 3 months and left Cedar Hollow quietly, without a single farewell newsletter. The insurance company's denial of her fraudulent claim left the HOA facing a genuine funding gap for the bridge's full replacement. But the community, energized rather than discouraged by everything that had happened, organized a special assessment vote that passed with overwhelming support just weeks after Diane's departure from the neighborhood entirely. I worked directly with Frank Delgado and a properly licensed structural firm to design the new span, rated conservatively at 12 tons, built with modern materials and full transparency at every stage, public design reviews, open construction updates, and a permanent digital archive of every inspection report filed from that point forward. Mr. attended every single planning meeting despite his age, insisting he wanted to see this bridge built properly before he was gone. A promise he'd apparently made to himself decades earlier when he'd first suspected something wasn't quite right about Harold Whitfield's original 1987 rebar order all those years before. Carla, Tom, and Priya remained close friends through the entire rebuilding process. The 4 of us bonded permanently by everything we'd survived together, meeting regularly even after the immediate crisis had fully passed, simply to check in on each other and on the slow, steady progress of the new construction underway. Sophie visited the construction site with me most weekends, watching the new steel supports rise from the creek bed with genuine fascination, asking increasingly sophisticated questions about load ratings and safety margins that made me quietly proud of exactly what she was absorbing from everything our family had lived through together. Mark, who'd stayed up with me through so many sleepless nights of strain gauge readings and quiet dread, told me once, watching the new bridge take shape, that he'd never been more certain of anything than he was of marrying someone who refused to stop fighting for the truth even when it cost her everything. The new bridge's dedication ceremony took place 5 months after the collapse, a genuine celebration this time rather than a hollow photo opportunity, with the entire neighborhood gathering not on the span itself out of respect for proper safety protocol, but along the banks where the old bridge had finally given way months earlier. Frank Delgado spoke briefly, praising the community's resilience and, more specifically, the persistent documentation of one resident whose refusal to stop gathering evidence had ultimately ensured that a preventable structural failure caused no injuries at all, despite everything working against that outcome for months beforehand. Mr. The ribbon this time, his hands steady despite his age, finally seeing the promise he'd apparently carried privately for decades fulfilled in front of the entire neighborhood he'd called home since Cedar Hollow was first built. He hugged me afterward, whispering that my father would have been proud of this. I hadn't expected that sentence to affect me the way it did. Standing there at the edge of the rebuilt bridge with Sophie's small hand in mine, thinking about my father's flagged recommendation buried and crossed out decades earlier, finally honored in steel and concrete built exactly the way he'd always insisted things should be. The community elected a new HOA board within weeks, with transparency reforms built directly into the updated bylaws, public infrastructure reports, mandatory third-party inspections, and a formal whistleblower protection clause specifically inspired by everything I'd endured trying to raise the alarm months earlier without official support behind me. I declined the nomination for HOA president myself when neighbors suggested it, preferring instead to remain chair of the infrastructure committee, the role that actually suited what I did best and cared most about protecting. Priya ran instead, winning easily, promising a very different kind of leadership than Cedar Hollow had known for 9 years. Diane's case concluded formally about 8 months after the collapse. Her plea agreement finalized with a suspended sentence, significant restitution payments, and a permanent ban from serving on any HOA board within the state. Quiet, unglamorous ending for a woman who'd once controlled an entire neighborhood through fear and favors alone. I heard through the county grapevine, months later, that she'd moved to another state entirely, taking a quiet administrative job far removed from anything resembling community leadership. I felt no satisfaction hearing it, only a tired, settled sense that the whole exhausting saga had finally reached the ending it always should have. The strain gauges I'd installed that first frightened night stayed in place permanently on the new bridge, now fully authorized and monitored by the county itself, feeding live data to a public dashboard any resident could check whenever they wanted absolute reassurance about exactly what they were walking or driving across. Cedar Hollow's next annual newsletter, the first written under Priya's leadership, opened with a full, honest account of everything that had happened, the original shortcut, the months of denial, the midnight collapse, and the community's collective decision to demand transparency going forward, no matter how uncomfortable that honesty occasionally proved. I read that newsletter standing in my kitchen, the same room where I'd once spread out printouts and strain gauge data late into countless anxious nights, and felt something finally settle inside me that had stayed clenched tight since the very first day I'd watched an overloaded truck groan across that old bridge. Sophie asked me, around that time, whether I still worried about the new bridge the way I'd worried about the old one. I told her honestly that I didn't, because this time, everyone involved had finally agreed that the truth mattered more than convenience, and that, more than any steel beam, was what actually kept a bridge safe. Nearly a year after the collapse, on the exact weekend of the new bridge's first anniversary as a completed structure, Cedar Hollow held its first fully community-organized celebration since everything had happened. No ribbon-cutting theatrics this time. Just a simple picnic along the creek bank where families gathered freely and easily. I stood near the new bridge that afternoon watching Sophie race across it with two other kids from the neighborhood, their laughter echoing off the water below, and felt the full weight of everything finally lift from my shoulders in a way it hadn't fully managed to during any of the months preceding it. Priya found me there, handing me a lemonade and nodding toward the crowd of neighbors gathered comfortably along the banks, many of whom had once laughed at my warnings or crossed the street to avoid being seen near me during the worst of the conflict. "They know now," she said simply.
That's what
Tom joined us a moment later, mentioning that the county had cited Cedar Hollow's new transparency model as an example for other HOA communities dealing with similar infrastructure concerns. Frank Delgado apparently referencing our story specifically in a regional training seminar for inspectors handling emergency closure procedures going forward. Carla arrived with her own kids in tow, her deck edition long since completed under an honest, fully documented permit process rather than the quiet favor Diane had once dangled over her. She told me she'd finally stopped feeling afraid every time an HOA meeting was announced on the community calendar. Mr. now 82, sat comfortably in a folding chair near the water's edge, watching the new bridge with quiet satisfaction, occasionally telling anyone who'd listen the full story of Harold Whitfield's original rebar shortcut. No longer a whispered secret over coffee but a fully documented, openly acknowledged piece of the neighborhood's history. Mark grilled burgers nearby with a few other husbands, occasionally glancing over at me with the same steady, quiet pride he'd shown throughout the entire ordeal, never once suggesting I should have simply let things go, understanding better than most exactly why I never could have walked away from what I'd discovered. I thought, watching Sophie and her friends chase each other back and forth across the sturdy new span, about how differently this same scene could have ended if I hadn't spent months mapping every hour that bridge sat empty versus full, if I hadn't installed those first frightened strain gauges under a half moon. The collapse itself had been, in its own devastating way, inevitable by the time it finally happened. The fatigue, the shortcuts, Diane's reckless deadline all converging toward a structural failure nothing short of complete replacement could have ultimately prevented. What had never been inevitable was whether anyone would be standing on it when it fell. That distinction, I realized standing there in the late afternoon sun, was the entire story in miniature. Diane Whitfield had built her whole plan around forcing a bridge to fail on her schedule for her profit. I had spent every quiet, exhausting hour making absolutely certain it would fail on nobody's terms but its own. A local reporter, not Denise Ortiz this time but a journalist working on a longer feature piece about HOA accountability nationally, approached me at the picnic asking if I'd be willing to share the full story for a wider audience beyond the regional coverage it had already received months earlier. I hesitated at first, still uncomfortable with attention, but agreed eventually, understanding that other communities facing their own version of Diane Whitfield might benefit from knowing exactly what patient, careful documentation could accomplish even against someone who controlled nearly every lever of power around them for years beforehand. The feature published 2 months later, detailing the entire timeline from the first overloaded truck crossing to the final community celebration, quoting Frank Delgado's assessment that Cedar Hollow's outcome represented a rare best-case scenario for a structural failure that could easily have ended in tragedy under slightly different timing. I read that phrase, rare best-case scenario, several times after the article published, thinking about how close the timing genuinely had been, how a single miscalculation about Diane's midnight plans might have meant a very different, far more devastating ending to everything that had unfolded across those exhausting months. But it hadn't ended that way, because I'd refused to stop watching, refused to stop measuring, refused to stop mapping every possible hour someone might be standing where they shouldn't be. The bridge had fallen exactly as I'd feared it eventually would. It had simply fallen into an empty space I'd spent months clearing. Diane's name came up rarely in Cedar Hollow after that first anniversary celebration, the neighborhood having largely moved past the exhausting drama of her final months as president, more interested now in ordinary things, school schedules, holiday decorations, the small, comfortable rhythms of a community finally at peace with itself again. I still thought about her occasionally, not with anger exactly, but with a lingering, complicated understanding of exactly how someone spends 9 years convincing themselves that control and denial are simply different names for leadership, until the structure underneath that belief finally gives way completely, the same way old timber eventually does. The regulatory reforms inspired by Cedar Hollow's story spread slowly to a handful of other communities across the state. HOA boards adopting similar transparency requirements and whistleblower protections after hearing Frank Delgado's seminar presentation or reading the feature article that had eventually reached a much wider audience than I'd ever expected. I received occasional messages from strangers in other neighborhoods, facing their own versions of overloaded infrastructure or dismissive HOA leadership, asking for advice on documentation, strain gauges, or simply how to keep going when everyone around you insists you're the problem instead of the person trying to prevent one. I always told them the same thing, the truest thing I'd learned across the entire ordeal: you don't have to win the argument in the room. You just have to keep the proof intact. Keep people away from the danger while you gather it. And trust that the truth, given enough patient documentation, eventually holds its own weight. 2 years after the collapse, the new bridge remained exactly as sturdy as the day it was dedicated, its public strain gauge dashboard showing steady, unremarkable numbers day after day, the kind of quiet, boring reliability that meant, in the language my father had taught me long ago, that it was doing its job perfectly. Sophie, now 13, occasionally mentioned the story to friends at school with a strange mixture of pride and mild embarrassment, the way teenagers do about anything involving their parents becoming locally, briefly famous for something. I never pushed the story on her. She simply grew up understanding, matter-of-factly, why it mattered. Cedar Hollow itself had changed in quieter ways too. Board meetings now regularly attended by residents who'd once stayed home assuming nothing they said would matter.
Infrastructure reports posted publicly without anyone needing to fight for access. A community that had learned, painfully but permanently, what unchecked authority could eventually cost everyone.
I still chaired the infrastructure committee, though the urgency that had once consumed every waking hour had settled into something calmer. More sustainable routine inspections, transparent budgeting, the unglamorous, essential work of simply keeping a community's shared structures honestly maintained instead of quietly neglected until crisis forced the issue. Frank Delgado retired from the county the following spring, stopping by Cedar Hollow one last time before he did, walking the new bridge slowly with his hands in his pockets, telling me it remained one of the cases he was proudest of handling correctly, even though, especially because no one had gotten hurt. I asked him once, near the end of that final visit, whether he thought Diane had ever truly understood the danger she'd been creating, or whether she'd simply convinced herself so completely of her own narrative that the risk never felt real to her until the exact moment it finally, undeniably was. He considered the question for a long moment before answering carefully. The way he answered most things. People like that usually know. Somewhere underneath everything, he said. They just build enough noise around themselves that they never have to sit quietly with what they know. You never let her have that luxury. Elena, I thought about that answer often in the months afterward, turning it over the way I once turned over strain gauge data late at night, understanding finally that the real fight had never simply been about bridges or bylaws or insurance fraud. It had been about refusing to let convenient noise replace uncomfortable, necessary truth. The picnic tables along Miller's Creek filled every summer weekend now. Families gathering easily on both banks. Children racing across the sturdy new span without a single adult flinching at the sound of footsteps overhead the way I once had, watching from my kitchen window with a trail camera and a growing sense of dread. I still walked out to the bridge occasionally, alone, usually in the early evening when the light turned gold across the water, just to stand there quietly and remember everything it had taken to get from that first overloaded truck crossing to this steady, unremarkable, thoroughly ordinary peace the community now enjoyed. Diane resurfaced briefly in the local news nearly 3 years after the collapse. A short item noting she'd attempted, unsuccessfully, to join a homeowners association board in her new state, only for a routine background check to surface the Cedar Hollow case and her permanent statewide HOA leadership ban, blocking the attempt entirely. I read that brief news item once, feeling nothing sharper than a faint, distant recognition, the way you might notice a scar you'd genuinely forgotten was still there. Whatever hold Diane Whitfield had once had over my daily life, my sleep, my sense of safety in my own neighborhood, had long since fully faded. What remained instead was simpler and far more durable, a bridge rated honestly for the loads that actually crossed it, a community that checked its own infrastructure, reports without needing to be reminded, and a daughter growing up understanding that patient, careful truth eventually outlasts even the loudest, most entrenched denial. Mark and I sat on our back porch one evening around that same time, watching the sunset settle gold and orange over the rooftops toward Miller's Creek, and he asked, almost idly, whether I ever regretted how much of those months I'd spent consumed entirely by trail cameras, strain gauges, and quiet dread. I told him the truth. I regretted the fear, the isolation, the nights I couldn't sleep imagining what might happen if I'd guessed wrong about timing. But I never once regretted refusing to look away from what I'd found underneath that bridge, because looking away would have cost far more than my own comfort. Priya's second term as HOA president passed smoothly, the community settling into a rhythm defined less by any single dramatic crisis and more by the steady, unglamorous accumulation of small, honest decisions made openly rather than quietly, exactly the kind of leadership Cedar Hollow had gone 9 years without before her. I occasionally ran into Carla at the grocery store, our kids now old enough to carpool together for school activities, and we sometimes talked briefly about how strange it still felt, years later, that an ordinary footbridge had once nearly cost the entire neighborhood so much before finally teaching it something lasting. Tom eventually moved onto the HOA board himself, chairing a new resident advisory committee modeled loosely on the transparency reforms that had followed the collapse. ensuring no future HOA leader in Cedar Hollow could quietly accumulate the kind of unchecked authority Diane Whitfield had wielded for nearly a decade before anyone stopped her. Mr. passed away peacefully 4 years after the new bridge's dedication. At 86, his family telling me afterward that he'd specifically requested his memorial gathering take place along Miller's Creek, near the span he'd waited decades to see finally built the right way, exactly as it always should have been. I stood at that memorial with the rest of the neighborhood, watching the creek move steadily beneath the sturdy new bridge, thinking about how many quiet, stubborn, ordinary people it had actually taken to stop one determined woman from turning a shortcut into a tragedy nobody could have undone once it finally happened. The county eventually adopted Cedar Hollow's public strain gauge dashboard model as a recommended standard for other aging community structures across the region.
Frank Delgado's successor citing our bridge specifically as proof that transparent, continuous monitoring cost far less than the alternative, both financially and, more importantly, in human terms.
I gave occasional talks after that, mostly to small groups of HOA board members or civil engineering students, always framing the story the same careful way, not as a dramatic tale of confrontation and victory, but as a patient, unglamorous case study in what it actually takes to protect people who don't yet know they're at risk. Sophie, now 16 and increasingly interested in engineering herself, sometimes sat in on those talks, occasionally asking sharper questions than most of the adults in the room, and I found myself, more than once, quietly grateful that whatever fear those months had cost our family, they'd also taught her something durable about integrity. On the 5th anniversary of the collapse, Cedar Hollow held a small, understated gathering by the creek. Nothing like the grand celebrations of earlier years. Just a handful of longtime residents remembering together how close everything had once come to ending very differently than the quiet, ordinary peace they now took entirely for granted. Frank Delgado attended, retired but still sharp, standing near the water with a plate of potato salad, telling a small cluster of newer residents the full story from the beginning, the falsified 1987 addendum, the leaked insurance emails, the midnight collapse into an empty bridge that never should have held anyone in the first place. The thing people forget, he told them, is that the collapse itself wasn't the miracle here. Bridges fail, and enough shortcuts. That part was always coming. The miracle was one resident refusing to stop watching, refusing to stop measuring, until she knew exactly when and where it was safe to be wrong. I stood a little apart from that conversation, watching Sophie, now a college engineering student home for the weekend, explain load ratings to a curious younger neighbor with the same quiet confidence I remembered feeling the very first time I'd knelt in the creek bed with my father's old tape measure years earlier. Mark found me there eventually, handing me a drink, following my gaze toward our daughter mid-explanation. "You did that," he said simply, nodding toward Sophie. I told him it wasn't really about me. It was about a whole community finally learning, the hard way, what happens when convenience gets allowed to outrank honesty for too long. I thought, watching the creek move steadily beneath the sturdy, honestly rated bridge that had replaced Diane Whitfield's compromised legacy. About every quiet night I'd spent alone with strain gauge data and a growing sense of dread, and understood finally that none of it had been wasted. Not one single sleepless hour of it. The story of Cedar Hollow's bridge occasionally still circulated in HOA newsletters and county safety trainings across the region, always ending the same simple, satisfying way. A community that could have lost everything to one leader's arrogance instead lost nothing at all, because one resident refused to stop paying attention. Diane Whitfield's name faded almost entirely from local memory over the years that followed, replaced instead by the bridge itself, sturdy, transparent, honestly maintained, standing as the only lasting monument anyone in Cedar Hollow ultimately needed to the entire exhausting, frightening, and finally vindicating saga that had unfolded there. I never sought recognition beyond what naturally came, never framed myself as any kind of hero in the story I told when neighbors or reporters occasionally asked. I simply told the truth, plainly, the same way I always had. A bridge was overloaded, someone refused to look away, and no one got hurt. That, in the end, was the whole story worth telling. Not triumph, not vengeance, not even justice exactly, though all three eventually arrived in their own slow, unglamorous ways. Just patience, careful documentation, and the quiet, stubborn refusal to let convenience decide who got to stand safely on solid ground and who didn't. Every time I walked across Miller's Creek now, feeling the new bridge's steady, unremarkable solidness beneath my feet, I thought briefly of my father, of the addendum he'd flagged, and been overruled on decades earlier, finally honored not through anger or vindication but through steel poured honestly, exactly the way he'd always insisted it should be. Sophie graduated with her engineering degree the following spring, choosing structural specialization specifically, telling me during the ceremony that she wanted to spend her career making sure other communities never needed a Diane Whitfield story of their own to finally learn what honest infrastructure actually required from the people responsible for it. I sat in that graduation audience with Mark beside me, thinking about the 11-year-old who'd once asked me nervously whether the bridge was going to fall down. Now a grown engineer determined to prevent exactly that outcome for other families entirely, in neighborhoods neither of us had ever even visited yet. Cedar Hollow itself continued on quietly after that. Ordinary in all the best ways, birthday parties at the pool, farmers markets crossing the bridge every Tuesday morning, children learning to ride bikes in the park exactly as they always had, all of it resting now on a structure that had genuinely earned their trust. I retired from chairing the infrastructure committee eventually, handing the role to a younger engineer who'd moved into the neighborhood specifically drawn by its reputation for transparency, telling her honestly during the handoff that the job was mostly patience now, mostly routine, mostly the quiet, unglamorous work of keeping things honestly maintained. It wasn't always this calm, I told her. And she asked, curious, what had changed? I gave her the short version of the story, watching her expression shift slowly from polite interest to genuine attention the way everyone's eventually did, and finished the same way I always finished telling it, plainly and without embellishment. A bridge failed exactly the way it was always going to fail, I said. The only real choice anyone ever had was whether someone would be standing on it when it finally did. She nodded slowly, understanding, and I knew Cedar Hollow's bridge was in careful, honest hands for whatever came next. Years later, long after most of the immediate drama had faded into simple neighborhood history, I still kept the original 1987 addendum framed in my home office, my father's flagged recommendation and Harold Whitfield's dismissive red pen crossing it out. A permanent reminder of exactly what happens when convenience gets to overrule careful, documented caution. Beside it hung a photo from the new bridge's dedication ceremony. Mr. Castellano cutting the ribbon with steady hands. Sophie beaming beside him. Frank Delgado standing. Quietly in the background, a small, ordinary moment that had taken months of fear, documentation, and one very carefully timed midnight collapse to finally arrive at. I thought sometimes about how differently everything could have unfolded if I'd simply stopped pushing after Diane first stripped my title.
If I'd let the trail camera gather dust. If I trusted her assurance that a 40-year-old bridge would simply hold a little longer the way it always somehow had before.
But I hadn't stopped. And neither had Priya, Tom, Carla, or Mr. Castellano, each of them choosing at some quiet, difficult moment to risk Diane's leverage and displeasure rather than stay silent about something they knew, somewhere underneath their own fear, needed saying out loud regardless of the personal cost involved. That, I eventually came to understand, was the real ending to the story, more than any collapse or courtroom outcome ever could be, not one person standing alone against an entrenched authority, but an entire quiet network of neighbors finally choosing truth over comfortable silence. One difficult conversation at a time. Diane Whitfield had built 9 years of control on the assumption that fear would always outlast conscience in Cedar Hollow. She'd been right about nearly everyone for a very long time. She simply hadn't accounted for the handful of people who eventually decided fear wasn't actually worth what silence would ultimately cost them. I still drove past the bridge most days. An ordinary errand now rather than an anxious inspection. Watching families cross it without a second thought. Exactly the way I'd once dreamed they might again someday during the darkest, most exhausting stretches of that long, frightening ordeal months and years earlier. The strain gauge dashboard, still public, still updating quietly in the background of the county's website, remained the single most boring, unremarkable set of numbers. In all of Cedar Hollow, flat, steady, well within tolerance. Exactly what a bridge's numbers should look like when everyone involved finally told the truth about it. I understood. Standing on that bridge one final quiet evening years after everything had settled. That boring numbers were the entire point of everything I'd fought for. Not drama. Not vindication. Not even justice exactly. Just the simple, unglamorous safety of a structure everyone could finally trust without needing to think twice. Sophie called that same evening from her first engineering job in another state, excited about a small infrastructure project she was helping inspect. And I listened to her explain. Load ratings with the same careful precision my father once used. Feeling something settle fully into place that had been shifting since that first overloaded truck years ago. I told her, before we hung up, the same thing Frank Delgado had once told me, that the real miracle was never the collapse itself, only ever whether anyone was standing there when it happened. She said she understood completely. I believed her, and I hung up the phone feeling, finally, entirely at peace. The insurance investigation into Diane's original claim closed permanently that same year. Its findings entered formally into state HOA fraud prevention training materials, cited specifically as a textbook case of how documented negligence, once properly assembled, could unravel even the most carefully controlled cover-up over enough patient, persistent time. Cedar Hollow's property values, once briefly shaken by the scandal's local notoriety, recovered fully, and then some within a few years. New families drawn specifically by the neighborhood's reputation for transparency and careful infrastructure maintenance. A reputation built directly on the very crisis that had once threatened to define it far more darkly. Gary Fenn's case concluded with a permanent state ban on ever holding an engineering license again. A small, quiet consequence compared to what might have happened had that midnight collapse occurred even a few minutes earlier or later, with a driver still trapped inside the cab when the timber finally gave way completely. Ray Dobbins eventually found honest work in another state, occasionally reaching out to Carla over the years with brief, guarded updates, apparently carrying his own quiet weight from that midnight collapse long after the formal investigations had closed and everyone else in Cedar Hollow had mostly moved on with their lives. Diane herself never returned to Cedar Hollow. Not even once. Her name surfacing only rarely in old newsletters or county training slides. A cautionary footnote, rather than the commanding presence she'd once been for 9 controlling years over a neighborhood that had finally, painfully, learned to stop being afraid of her. I kept the old faded 5-ton sign from the original bridge, salvaged from the wreckage before cleanup crews hauled the rest away, hanging it quietly in my garage beside my father's old tools. A small, weathered reminder of exactly how much can hinge on whether anyone bothers to look up and read the warning. Cedar Hollow's bridge still stands today, sturdy and unremarkable, carrying strollers and bicycles and farmers' market crowds across Miller's Creek exactly the way its predecessor once did, before ambition and denial and one desperate midnight gamble finally caught up with a structure that had been quietly failing for far longer than anyone admitted. I still walk it most evenings, feeling nothing now but the ordinary, unremarkable solidness of honest engineering beneath my feet, thinking sometimes of my father, of Mr. Castellano, of every neighbor who finally found their courage, and of one determined woman who learned, far too late, that some limits simply cannot be argued with. The bridge held, because the truth finally did too, and because, on the one night it truly mattered, no one but the truck that broke it was ever standing there to find out. The END.